Throughout his entire life, Matthew believed that purity was synonymous with silence. He grew up within the confines of a house in rural Tennessee where the sacred was a prison of behaviors, where words were measured and desires repressed. Raised under the unwavering rigidity of a deeply religious father, his existence was molded around guilt and duty. He never knew the touch of intimate affection, never allowed himself to even think about pleasure. At 24 years old, still a virgin, he considered himself immaculate, but not by choice, rather by fear. Fear of himself, fear of failing the stern God he had learned to fear, fear of feeling. The small Baptist church where his father preached every Sunday had been the center of Matthew's world for as long as he could remember. The wooden pews, the stained glass windows that cast colored shadows on his pale hands during morning services, the smell of old Bibles and polished wood, everything was familiar, predictable, safe. His father, Reverend Thomas Clark, was a man of few words but stern convictions. His sermons spoke of fire and brimstone, of the narrow path to salvation, and of the countless ways the human soul could be led astray. Matthew had absorbed every word, every warning, every prohibition. His childhood had been a series of thou shalt nots that carved themselves into his consciousness like commandments on stone tablets. Dancing was forbidden, secular music was the devil's lure, and any thought of romantic desire was a sin that required immediate prayer and repentance. He learned to kneel by his bed each night, asking forgiveness for thoughts he couldn't control, for the stirrings of his young heart that seemed to betray everything he'd been taught to believe. The other children at school seemed to live in a different world, one filled with laughter, casual touches, whispered secrets about crushes and first kisses. Matthew watched from the periphery, always apart, always different. His classmates learned to leave him alone after a while, understanding that the preacher's son lived by different rules. He told himself he didn't mind the isolation, that it was proof of his dedication to a higher calling. When he turned 18, his father expected him to attend seminary, to follow in his footsteps and become a man of the cloth. But Matthew felt no calling, no divine inspiration that would guide him toward the pulpit. Instead, he felt an overwhelming desire to disappear, to find a place where he could exist without the constant weight of expectation and judgment. The argument that followed was the first and last time he ever openly defied his father. "You're abandoning your faith," Reverend Clark had thundered, his face red with anger and disappointment. "Everything I've taught you, everything I've sacrificed to keep you on the righteous path, you're throwing it all away." Matthew had stood in the doorway of their modest home, a single suitcase in his hand, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not abandoning anything, Father. I just need to find my own way." "There is only one way," his father replied coldly, "and if you walk out that door, you're choosing to walk away from it." That was 6 years ago. 6 years of silence between them. 6 years of Matthew drifting from one small town to another, taking odd jobs that required little interaction with others. He worked in libraries, cleaned office buildings at night, delivered newspapers in the early morning hours when the streets were empty and quiet. He lived in tiny apartments and boarding houses, always alone, always careful to maintain the walls he'd built around himself. It was during one of these aimless periods that he saw the advertisement in the Nashville Tennessean. A family in the wealthy Belle Meade neighborhood was seeking a live-in caretaker for an elderly woman. The job description was simple: assistance with daily activities, medication management, light housekeeping, and companionship. The salary was generous, far more than he'd ever earned before, and something about the straightforward nature of the posting appealed to him. When he arrived at the address on Linwood Boulevard, Matthew felt like he was entering a different universe. The mansion was a testament to Southern elegance, with white columns and manicured gardens that spoke of old money and careful preservation. The wrought iron gates opened silently as he approached, as if sensing his arrival. The driveway curved through ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss, creating a tunnel of green shade that felt both welcoming and mysterious. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman answered the door herself, despite her age and the blindness that had claimed her sight 5 years earlier. She was a small woman with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a simple but expensive dress that Matthew recognized as the kind his mother used to admire in magazine photographs. Her clouded eyes seemed to look right through him, but her smile was warm and genuine. "You must be Matthew," she said, extending a delicate hand that was surprisingly strong when he shook it. "I've been expecting you." There was something in the way she said it, not just that she'd been waiting for him to arrive for their scheduled interview, but something deeper, as if she'd been expecting him specifically, as if his arrival had been predetermined somehow. Matthew dismissed the feeling as nervousness about the interview, but it lingered at the edges of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream. Mrs. Whitman led him through rooms that seemed frozen in time, antique furniture polished to a mirror shine, oil paintings of long-dead relatives watching from ornate frames, Persian rugs that muffled their footsteps as they walked. The house was beautiful, but felt lonely, as if it was waiting for something or someone to bring it back to life. "I'll be honest with you, Matthew," Mrs. Whitman said as they settled in her sitting room, a cozy space filled with books and the lingering scent of gardenias from the garden outside. "I don't need much physical care. I manage quite well on my own, despite what my family might think. What I need is someone who understands the value of silence, someone who won't try to fill every moment with unnecessary chatter." Matthew nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I prefer quiet environments, ma'am. I wouldn't want to intrude on your privacy." "Privacy," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, privacy is important, but so is connection, don't you think? The right kind of connection, with the right person, at the right time." Again, there was something in her tone that suggested layers of meaning he couldn't quite grasp, but the job was exactly what he'd been looking for, a chance to disappear into a routine that would require little of him beyond basic competence and discretion. Mrs. Whitman offered him the position on the spot, and Matthew accepted immediately. She showed him to his quarters on the second floor, a comfortable suite with its own bathroom, and a view of the gardens that stretched toward the distant Cumberland River. It was the nicest place he'd ever lived, and for the first time in years, he felt something that might have been hope. The first few weeks passed peacefully. Matthew settled into a routine that felt both familiar and liberating. He helped Mrs. Whitman with her morning medications, prepared simple meals that they ate together in comfortable silence, and spent the afternoons reading to her from classic novels and contemporary biographies. She was an intelligent woman with strong opinions about politics and literature, and their conversations gradually became less formal and more genuine. In the evenings, Matthew would walk through the gardens or sit in his room, reading books from Mrs. Whitman's extensive library. It was a quiet existence, but for the first time since leaving his father's house, he felt at peace. The constant anxiety that had followed him from job to job seemed to fade in the serene atmosphere of the Whitman estate. He began to think that maybe this was what his life was meant to be, simple, uncomplicated, devoted to caring for someone who needed him without demanding more than he was capable of giving. Mrs. Whitman never asked about his past, never pried into his personal life or his reasons for choosing such solitary work. She seemed to understand that some people needed space to heal from wounds that couldn't be easily explained. But Matthew was beginning to learn that peace was often just the calm before the storm, and that the universe had a way of disrupting even the most carefully constructed quiet lives. He had no way of knowing that his orderly existence was about to be turned upside down by forces he couldn't have imagined, that the silence he'd wrapped around himself like armor was about to be shattered by truths he'd never suspected, and feelings he'd spent his entire life trying to suppress. As he went to sleep on what would be his last night of innocence, Matthew felt grateful for the sanctuary he'd found in Mrs. Whitman's home. Tomorrow would bring changes that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his past and his future. But tonight, he was still the quiet caretaker who believed that safety lay in solitude and that love was a luxury he could never afford. The storm arrived on a Wednesday night in late October, bringing with it winds that rattled the windows of the Whitman mansion and rain that drummed against the roof like impatient fingers. Matthew had ventured out to the nearby pharmacy to pick up Mrs. Whitman's monthly prescriptions, a routine task that he usually completed without incident. But tonight, the weather had delayed him, and by the time he returned, water was dripping. From his jacket and his hair was plastered against his forehead. He fumbled with his keys at the front door, eager to get inside and out of the storm. The house was darker than usual. Mrs. Whitman typically left the foyer light on for him when he went out in the evenings, but tonight the entrance was shrouded in shadows. Matthew assumed she had already retired for the night, which wasn't unusual given the late hour and the dramatic weather. But as he stepped into the foyer and shook the rain from his jacket, he noticed a warm glow emanating from the living room. Curious, he moved quietly down the hallway, not wanting to disturb Mrs. Whitman if she was still awake and reading by the fireplace. What he found instead stopped him dead in his tracks. A man sat in the leather armchair that faced the window, silhouetted against the lightning that occasionally illuminated the night sky. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and olive skin that suggested Mediterranean heritage. Even in the dim light, Matthew could see that he was impeccably dressed. His suit looked expensive, tailored, the kind of clothing that spoke of wealth and sophistication. But it wasn't his appearance that made Matthew's breath catch in his throat. It was the way the stranger sat, completely at ease in Mrs. Whitman's private space, as if he belonged there. The man turned at the sound of Matthew's footsteps, and their eyes met across the room. In that instant, Matthew felt something he'd never experienced before, a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with instinct. The stranger's eyes were dark and intelligent, framed by thick lashes that gave his gaze an almost hypnotic quality. When he smiled, it was slow and knowing, as if he'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. "I've been waiting for you since yesterday," the man said, his voice low and rich with an accent that Matthew couldn't quite place. It wasn't entirely American, but it wasn't foreign either. Something in between, sophisticated and worldly. Matthew stood frozen in the doorway, the pharmacy bag still clutched in his hand, water still dripping from his jacket onto the Persian rug beneath his feet. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications he didn't understand, but felt in every nerve ending of his body. "I'm sorry," Matthew stammered, finally finding his voice. "I didn't know Mrs. Whitman was expecting company. I can come back later or—" "Don't apologize," the stranger said, rising from the chair with fluid grace. He was even taller than Matthew had first thought, probably 6'3" or 4", with the kind of presence that seemed to fill the room even when he moved quietly. "I'm Alexander Whitman. Eleanor is my aunt." The surname clicked into place, but it raised more questions than it answered. In all the weeks Matthew had been working for Mrs. Whitman, she had never mentioned family members, never received phone calls or letters, never spoken of anyone who might visit. He had assumed she was alone in the world, which had made him feel a kinship with her that went beyond their professional relationship. "I didn't know she had family," Matthew said, still hovering uncertainly in the doorway. Alexander's smile widened slightly, revealing perfect white teeth. "She doesn't talk about us much. We're complicated people with complicated lives, but she's important to me and so is her well-being." His gaze swept over Matthew appraisingly, not in a way that felt invasive, but rather like he was solving a puzzle. "She's told me quite a lot about you, actually. Matthew Clark from Tennessee, 24 years old, son of a preacher, quiet, dependable, trustworthy." Matthew felt heat rise in his cheeks. The fact that Mrs. Whitman had shared personal information about him with her nephew felt like a betrayal, though he couldn't say exactly why. "She seems to be doing well," he said carefully. "I try to take good care of her." "I'm sure you do," Alexander replied, moving closer. With each step, Matthew became more aware of the man's physical presence, the way he moved with confidence and purpose, the subtle scent of expensive cologne that mixed with something else, something warm and distinctly masculine. "But taking care of Eleanor isn't the only reason I'm here." Before Matthew could ask what he meant, Mrs. Whitman's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Alexander, dear, would you ask Matthew to join us for tea? I'm sure he's soaked to the bone from that dreadful storm." Alexander's eyes never left Matthew's face as he replied, "Of course, Aunt Eleanor." Matthew was just on his way. There was no polite way to decline. and Matthew found himself following Alexander toward the kitchen, acutely aware of the man walking beside him. In the bright light of the kitchen, Alexander was even more striking than he had been in the shadows of the living room. His skin was golden-toned, suggesting time spent in warmer climates, and his hands, Matthew noticed, were elegant and well-manicured, but showed the calluses of someone who wasn't afraid of physical work. Mrs. Whitman was sitting at the small table, where she and Matthew usually shared their meals, a delicate china tea service arranged before her. Despite her blindness, she moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of her domain. She looked up as they entered, her face bright with a happiness that Matthew had never seen before. "Matthew, dear, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said warmly. "Alexander arrived unexpectedly this afternoon. He's been traveling extensively and decided to pay his old aunt a visit." "Of course not," Matthew replied, though he was still processing the implications of Alexander's sudden appearance. "I'll just go change out of these wet clothes and leave you two to catch up." "Nonsense," Mrs. Whitman said firmly. "Sit down and have some tea. You'll catch your passing in those damp things, but you can change afterward. Besides, I want you two to get to know each other." Matthew reluctantly took the chair across from Alexander, accepting the cup of Earl Grey that Mrs. Whitman poured for him with practiced precision. The conversation that followed was polite but charged with undercurrents. He didn't understand. Alexander spoke about his travels, recent business trips to Dubai and London, a brief vacation in the Greek islands, plans for expanding his hotel empire into new markets. His world was so far removed from Matthew's quiet existence that it might as well have been on another planet. But what struck Matthew most was the way Alexander looked at him while he spoke. It wasn't just polite interest or casual friendliness. It was something deeper, more focused, as if he was studying Matthew's reactions and filing them away for future reference. And there was something else in his gaze, something that made Matthew's pulse quicken and his mouth go dry despite the hot tea he was sipping. "Matthew is wonderful company," Mrs. Whitman said, interrupting Matthew's thoughts. "He reads to me every afternoon, and we have the most interesting discussions about literature and current events. He's quite intelligent, you know, though he's far too modest to admit it." "I'm sure he is," Alexander agreed, his eyes still fixed on Matthew's face. "What do you like to read, Matthew?" "Oh, various things," Matthew replied vaguely, suddenly self-conscious about his tastes in literature. "Mrs. Whitman has an incredible library. I've been working my way through some of the classics I never had time to read before." "And what about your personal interests?" Alexander pressed gently. "Hobbies, dreams, things you're passionate about." The question caught Matthew off guard. No one had asked him about his dreams in years, and he wasn't sure he had any left to share. His life had become about survival and invisibility, not aspiration or passion. "I don't really have many hobbies," he admitted. "I like quiet activities, reading, walking, thinking." "Thinking about what?" Alexander's voice was soft, encouraging, as if he genuinely wanted to know what occupied Matthew's mind during those long, solitary hours. Matthew felt himself blushing again. "Just life, I suppose. Philosophy, spirituality, the nature of existence, the kinds of questions that don't have easy answers." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. "Those are important questions. Most people are too busy or too afraid to really think about them. What conclusions have you reached?" It was a surprisingly intimate question from someone he'd just met, but something about Alexander's manner made Matthew want to answer honestly. "I used to think I had all the answers," he said slowly. "I was raised with very specific beliefs about right and wrong, about how life should be lived. But lately I'm not so sure about anything." Mrs. Whitman had been listening quietly, but now she reached across the table and patted Matthew's hand gently. "Uncertainty can be a gift, dear. It means you're still growing, still open to possibilities you haven't considered before." The Moi conversation continued for another hour, touching on topics ranging from travel to philosophy to the changing nature of American society. Alexander was an engaging conversationalist, well-read and thoughtful, But Matthew noticed that he deflected personal questions about himself while continuing to draw Matthew out with skillful interrogation disguised as friendly interest. By the time they said goodnight, Matthew's head was spinning. He excused himself to change out of his damp clothes, but once he was alone in his room, he found himself pacing restlessly, unable to settle. Something fundamental had shifted in the quiet world he'd constructed for himself at the Whitman estate. Alexander's presence had introduced an element of chaos, of possibility, that both thrilled and terrified him. He stood at his window looking out at the storm that was finally beginning to pass and tried to understand what was happening to him. For the first time in his adult life, he was attracted to someone, not just physically, though the physical attraction was undeniable, but intellectually and emotionally as well. Alexander represented everything Matthew had been taught to avoid. Worldliness, a sophistication, the kind of magnetic personality that could lead a man away from the narrow path of righteousness. But as he finally climbed into bed, Matthew found himself wondering what it would be like to step off that path, to allow himself to want something more than safety and solitude. The thought should have filled him with guilt and self-recrimination, but instead, for the first time in his life, it filled him with hope. The days following Alexander's arrival transformed the quiet rhythm of the Whitman estate into something entirely different. What had once been a predictable sanctuary became charged with an energy that Matthew could feel thrumming through every room, every conversation, every stolen glance. Alexander didn't leave after that first stormy night, as Matthew had expected. Instead, he settled into the mansion as if he'd always belonged there, taking over the guest suite across the hall from Matthew's room. Matthew tried to maintain his usual routine, but it became increasingly difficult with Alexander's magnetic presence disrupting his carefully constructed peace. The man seemed to be everywhere, joining them for breakfast, reading the morning paper in the sunroom, while Matthew tended to Mrs. Whitman's medications, appearing in the garden while Matthew took his afternoon walks. It wasn't intrusive exactly, but it was constant, and Matthew found himself hyper-aware of Alexander's every movement, every word, every look. What troubled Matthew most was how natural it all felt. Alexander integrated seamlessly into their daily lives, helping with small tasks around the house, engaging Mrs. Whitman in animated discussions about family history and world events, and treating Matthew with a warmth that seemed to grow deeper each day. It was as if the three of them had been meant to live this way all along, and that thought terrified Matthew more than he cared to admit. On the fourth day of Alexander's stay, Mrs. Whitman made an announcement that changed everything. They were having lunch on the terrace, enjoying the unseasonably warm November weather, when she set down her teacup with a decisive clink and smiled at both men. "I have something to tell you both," she said, her voice carrying an excitement that Matthew hadn't heard before. "Something I've been keeping to myself for far too long." Alexander raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of curiosity and affection. "Aunt Eleanor, you're being mysterious. Should we be worried?" Mrs. Whitman laughed, a sound like silver bells in the afternoon breeze. "Not worried, dear. Amazed, perhaps. You see, I wrote something down many years ago. A letter, actually, which I've kept locked away in my desk drawer. In it, I described a young man who would come into my life when I needed him most. I wrote about his clear blue eyes, his gentle manner, his wounded soul that carried the mark of fire." Matthew felt the blood drain from his face. His eyes were indeed blue, and Mrs. Whitman had often commented on their clarity. As for being marked by fire, that was uncomfortably close to describing his strict religious upbringing and the spiritual battles he'd fought throughout his youth. "When did you write this letter?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully neutral, but Matthew caught the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes as he processed this information. 1997, Mrs. Whitman replied matter-of-factly. 26 years ago. I was going through a difficult time, feeling isolated and forgotten. I wrote the letter as a sort of prayer, I suppose, describing the companion I hoped would find his way to me someday. She reached across the table and found Matthew's hand, with uncanny accuracy. "And here you are, Matthew, everything I described down to the smallest detail." The implications hit Matthew like a physical blow. If Mrs. Whitman had truly written that letter in 1997, it meant his arrival here wasn't coincidence, it was something approaching destiny. But the rational part of his mind rebelled against such a notion. Coincidences happened. People saw patterns where none existed. There had to be a logical explanation. That's remarkable, he managed to say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. But surely it's just a fortunate coincidence. There must be many young men who fit that description. Mrs. Whitman squeezed his hand gently. Perhaps, but I don't think... So, you see, I also wrote about the person who would come to care for you, Matthew. Someone who would help you discover parts of yourself that you'd kept hidden away. Someone whose love would set you free. Matthew's gaze flew to Alexander, who was watching him with an intensity that made his heart race. There was something in Alexander's expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition that suggested he wasn't entirely caught off guard by his aunt's revelation. "Aunt Eleanor," Alexander said carefully, "are you saying you somehow predicted that Matthew and I would..." "Would what, dear?" Mrs. Whitman asked innocently, though there was a hint of mischief in her voice. "I'm simply sharing what I wrote all those years ago. What the two of you choose to do with that information is entirely up to you." The conversation moved on to other topics after that, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Matthew felt exposed, as if Mrs. Whitman had somehow seen into his soul and laid bare desires he'd barely acknowledged to himself. The attraction he felt toward Alexander wasn't just his secret anymore. It was apparently part of some grand design that had been set in motion decades before they'd even met. That evening, Matthew couldn't concentrate on the book he was trying to read. He kept replaying Mrs. Whitman's words, analyzing them from every angle, trying to find a rational explanation for what seemed impossible. Lost in thought, he didn't hear the soft knock on his door until it came a second time. "Come." He called, expecting to see Mrs. Whitman with a request for help with something. Instead, Alexander stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Alexander said, though he made no move to leave. He was wearing dark jeans and a simple white shirt, far more casual than his usual attire, and somehow the informal clothing made him seem more approachable and more dangerous at the same time. "Not at all," Matthew replied, though his pulse quickened at the sight of Alexander in his private space. "Is everything all right? Does Mrs. Whitman need something?" "She's fine. She retired early tonight." Alexander moved further into the room, his eyes taking in the modest furnishings, the stack of books on the nightstand, the simple cross that hung on the wall above Matthew's bed. "I wanted to talk to you about what she said today, about the letter." Matthew set aside his book and sat up straighter, acutely aware of the fact that he was wearing only a t-shirt and pajama pants. "It's extraordinary if it's true, though I'm not sure what to make of it." "What if it is true?" Alexander asked, settling into the chair near the window. "What if everything that's happened, your coming here, my arrival, the way we seem to understand each other, what if it's all part of something larger than coincidence?" Matthew felt his cheeks burning. "You think we understand each other?" Alexander's smile was slow and devastatingly attractive. "Don't you? From the moment I saw you standing in that doorway, soaked from the rain and looking like you'd seen a ghost, I felt like I'd been waiting for you my entire life. And I think you felt something too." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable and completely unexpected. Matthew had spent his whole life learning to suppress his desires, to deny the parts of himself that didn't fit into the narrow definition of acceptable behavior his father had drilled into him. But sitting here in the lamplight, with Alexander looking at him like he was something precious and worth waiting for, all of those carefully constructed walls began to crumble. "I did," Matthew whispered, the words barely audible. "I felt something, but I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to be the person you seem to think I am." Alexander leaned forward, his expression gentle but determined. "You don't have to be anyone other than who you are, Matthew. You're enough, exactly as you are." "But I'm not," Matthew protested. his voice breaking slightly. "I'm broken, Alexander. I've spent my whole life trying to be good, trying to follow the rules, trying to earn love that never came. I don't know how to want things for myself. I don't know how to believe I deserve them." Alexander stood up then, moving to sit on the edge of Matthew's bed. The mattress dipped under his weight, and suddenly they were close enough to touch, close enough for Matthew to smell that distinctive scent of cologne and warmth that seemed to surround Alexander like an aura. "What if I told you that you deserve everything?" Alexander said softly. "What if I told you that the rules you've been following were never meant to keep you safe, but to keep you small? What if the love you've been seeking has been here all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to reach for it?" Matthew's breath caught in his throat. "Alexander, what if I told you that I've been traveling the world for years, building an empire, accumulating wealth and success, but I've never felt as at home anywhere as I do sitting here with you in this simple room?" The confession was so unexpected, so raw and honest, that Matthew felt tears sting his eyes. "I don't understand. You could have anyone. You're sophisticated, successful, worldly. You're just the person I've been looking for without knowing it," Alexander interrupted. "You're kind and intelligent and beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with vanity or pretense. You see the world clearly, Matthew, even when you doubt yourself. And when you smile, which you don't do nearly enough, it's like watching the sun come up." Matthew felt something inside him breaking open, like a seed that had been dormant for years suddenly cracking and reaching toward light. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to be with someone. "I know," Alexander said gently. "And I'm not asking you to figure it all out tonight. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that what you're feeling isn't wrong, isn't something to be ashamed of. I'm asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, you're allowed to want something for yourself." They sat in silence for a long moment, the air between them charged with possibility and fear, and the kind of electric tension that comes just before a storm breaks. Matthew could feel his carefully ordered world shifting on its axis, could feel the person he'd always been making room for the person he might become. "Can I tell you something?" Matthew asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Anything. I've never wanted anything as much as I want to kiss you right now, and that terrifies me." Alexander's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "What terrifies you? More wanting it or the possibility that you might actually do it?" Matthew considered the question seriously, examining his fear from all angles, like he might examine a theological puzzle. "Both," he admitted, "but mostly I'm afraid that if I start letting myself want things, I won't know how to stop." "What if that's not a bad thing?" Alexander asked. "What if wanting things, the right things from the right person, is exactly what you're supposed to do?" And then, before Matthew could think of all the reasons why he shouldn't, before his father's voice could rise up in his mind with warnings about sin and temptation, before fear could paralyze him again, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to Alexander's in a kiss that was tentative and desperate and absolutely perfect. The world didn't end. Lightning didn't strike him down. Instead, for the first time in his life, Matthew felt completely and utterly alive, as if every nerve ending in his body had suddenly awakened to possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. The kiss changed everything, and nothing all at once. In the days that followed, Matthew and Alexander moved around each other with a new awareness, sharing stolen glances and brief touches that sent electricity through Matthew's entire being. Yet they maintained the careful facade of friendship whenever Mrs. Whitman was present, neither ready to acknowledge publicly what was growing between them. Matthew found himself caught between euphoria and terror. The awakening of his desires felt like emerging from a cave into brilliant sunlight, overwhelming, beautiful, and slightly painful all at once. Alexander was patient, never pushing for more than Matthew was ready to give, but his presence was a constant reminder of all the possibilities Matthew had never allowed himself to consider. It was during this delicate period of discovery that their fragile new world was shattered by an unexpected visitor. Matthew was in the garden, tending to Mrs. Whitman's prized roses. when he heard raised voices coming from the house. Through the open windows, he could make out Alexander's voice, tight with anger, and another man's voice he didn't recognize. Cold, calculating and somehow familiar in a way that made his stomach clench with unease. Abandoning the roses, Matthew hurried inside to find Alexander facing off with a man who looked remarkably similar to him. Same height, same dark hair, same olive complexion. But where Alexander radiated warmth and strength, this man seemed to emanate a cold calculation that made Matthew's skin crawl. "Marcus," Alexander was saying, his voice carefully controlled but vibrating with tension. "I told you never to come here." The man Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. His eyes swept over Matthew as he entered the room, and something in that gaze made Matthew feel exposed and vulnerable. "And I told you that family business comes first, brother. Always. Brother." The word hit Matthew like a physical blow. Alexander had never mentioned having a brother, had never spoken of any family beyond his Aunt Eleanor. But the resemblance was unmistakable, and the tension between them suggested a history filled with conflict and unresolved issues. Mrs. Whitman appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. Despite her blindness, she navigated the room, with sure steps, positioning herself between the two men like a shield. "Marcus, you're not welcome in this house. I thought I made that clear years ago." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that seemed to echo off the walls. "Oh, Aunt Eleanor, still protecting your precious Alexander. But this time, I'm not here for him. I'm here for our young friend Matthew." Matthew felt the blood drain from his face. "I don't understand. We've never met, haven't we?" Marcus pulled out a manila envelope from his jacket, withdrawing a series of photographs that he spread across the coffee table like playing cards. "Tell me, Matthew, what do you remember about the fire that took your mother's life?" The question hit Matthew like a sledgehammer. He hadn't spoken about the fire to anyone, not even Alexander. It was too painful, too wrapped up in guilt and confusion and childhood trauma. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, but his eyes were drawn to the photographs despite himself. The first few images were old, grainy newspaper clippings about a house fire in rural Tennessee 20 years ago. Matthew recognized the headlines, had seen them in the local paper archives during his desperate teenage years, when he'd tried to piece together what had really happened that night. But the next photos made his knees buckle. A man in a minister's collar, captured in candid shots outside a motel, entering and leaving at odd hours. The same man in what appeared to be surveillance photos, his face twisted with rage as he argued, with a woman Matthew recognized with a shock as his mother. And finally, most damning of all, the same man, fleeing a burning house in the dead of night, his face illuminated by the flames behind him. "Your father didn't perish in that fire, Matthew," Marcus said, his voice silky with false sympathy. "He started it. And then he ran, leaving you to believe you were an orphan while he reinvented himself somewhere else." "That's impossible," Matthew said, his voice barely a whisper. "My father was a good man. He would never—" "Your father was a fanatic who caught his wife with another man and decided that fire was the only way to cleanse the sin," Marcus continued relentlessly. "He's been living under an assumed name in North Carolina for the past 20 years, running a small church and pretending to be a widower. Would you like to know where?" Alexander stepped forward, his face dark with fury. "That's enough, Marcus. What do you want?" Marcus's smile widened. "What I've always wanted, brother. Justice. You see, our dear Aunt Eleanor has been very generous in her will. She's left everything to you, Alexander. The house, the investments, the considerable fortune our family built over generations. But I think Matthew deserves to know the truth about how his presence here isn't quite as coincidental as it seems." Mrs. Whitman's face had gone ashen, but she stood her ground. "Marcus, stop this." "Oh, but we're just getting to the good part," Marcus said, pulling out another document. "You see, Matthew, that letter our aunt supposedly wrote in 1997, it's real enough. But what she didn't tell you is that she's been searching for you specifically for over a decade. She hired private investigators, tracked down every detail of your life, arranged for that job advertisement to be placed exactly where you would see it. You didn't find your way here by chance. You were brought here deliberately." The room spun around Matthew as the implications sank in. Everything he'd believed about his new life, about finding sanctuary with Mrs. Whitman, about the growing love between him and Alexander, was it all orchestrated? Was he just a pawn in some elaborate game he didn't understand? "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do that?" Mrs. Whitman moved to his side, her face filled with anguish. "Because I knew what you'd suffered, dear. I knew about your father's fanaticism, about the fire, about the way you'd been left to navigate the world alone. I wanted to give you the love and security you'd never had." "And the convenient arrival of Alexander," Marcus interjected. "Another coincidence? Or did you arrange for your nephew to fall in love with your carefully selected protégé?" Alexander's face went white. "Aunt Eleanor, tell me you didn't." "I didn't arrange anything between you two," Mrs. Whitman said firmly. "What's growing between you is real, genuine, and beautiful. I simply created the opportunity for you to meet." "Say created the opportunity," Marcus repeated mockingly. "How delightfully manipulative. And now, Matthew, here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk away from this house, from this family, and from any claim to the inheritance that should rightfully be mine. In exchange, I'll keep quiet about your father's location and his crimes. But if you stay, if you continue this charade of a romance with my brother, I'll make sure the whole world knows that Thomas Clark is alive and living." As Pastor William Hayes in Asheville, North Carolina, the ultimatum hung in the air, like a sword over Matthew's head. He could feel Alexander's eyes on him, could sense Mrs. Whitman's distress, could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears as he tried to process everything he'd learned. But as he stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he'd thought he knew about his life, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing despair he expected to feel, Matthew found himself filled with a strange sense of clarity. The manipulation hurt, yes. The lies stung. But the feelings he'd discovered, the love growing between him and Alexander, the genuine affection he felt for Mrs. Whitman, the sense of home he'd found in this house, those were real. "You're right about one thing," Matthew said quietly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I was manipulated. I was brought here under false pretenses, but you're wrong about everything else." He turned to face Alexander, his heart hammering but his resolve firm. "I don't care how we met. I don't care if it was planned or orchestrated or written in a letter 26 years ago. What I feel for you is real. What we have together is real." Then he turned to Mrs. Whitman, taking her hands in his. "And I don't care about inheritances or family fortunes. I care about you. You gave me something I never had. A home, a family, a place where I belong. I'm not going to let anyone take that away." Finally, he faced Marcus, his chin lifted defiantly. "And as for my father, if he's alive, if he's been hiding from what he did, then maybe it's time for him to face the consequences. But I won't be blackmailed into abandoning the people I love." Marcus's face twisted with rage. "You have no idea what you're doing, boy. That inheritance belongs to whoever Eleanor chooses to leave it to," Alexander interrupted, stepping protectively beside Matthew. "And if she's chosen me, then I choose to share it with the man I love." The declaration hung in the air like a benediction. Alexander had said the words Matthew had been afraid to hope for, afraid to believe could be true. Love, not just attraction, or desire, or the convenience of proximity, but love. Marcus snarled, gathering up his photographs and documents. "This isn't over. You'll regret this decision." "The only thing I regret," Alexander said calmly, "is that it took me 32 years to find Matthew. Now get out of my aunt's house." After Marcus left, the three of them sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Finally, Mrs. Whitman spoke, her voice heavy with regret. "I'm so sorry, Matthew. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I was selfish. I wanted so desperately to give you the love you deserved that I convinced myself the means didn't matter." Matthew knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You did give me love, real love, and maybe I needed to be brought here. Maybe I was too scared to find it on my own. But what matters is what we do now." "What do you want to do now?" Alexander asked softly. Matthew stood up, moving to the window that looked out over the gardens where he'd spent so many peaceful hours. I want to find my father, not for revenge but for closure. I want to understand what happened, why he left me, whether there's any chance for forgiveness. Alexander moved to stand behind him, his hands resting gently on Matthew's shoulders. We'll find him together. Whatever you need, whatever you want to do, we'll do it together. And then? Matthew asked, leaning back against Alexander's solid warmth. Then we build a life together. Here if you want to stay, somewhere else if you want to travel. It doesn't matter where, as long as we're together. Mrs. Whitman cleared her throat, delicately. If I might make a suggestion, there's a lovely chapel in the gardens that hasn't been used in years. It would be perfect for a small, intimate ceremony. Matthew turned in Alexander's arms, his eyes wide with surprise. I'm asking you to marry me, Matthew Clark, Alexander said, his voice steady and sure. I'm asking you to take a leap of faith with me, to trust that what we have is strong enough to weather whatever storms come our way. The answer was yes. It had been yes from the moment they kissed, yes from the moment Alexander first looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes, yes from the moment Matthew allowed himself to believe that he deserved to be loved. 6 months later, Matthew stood in that same garden chapel, wearing a simple but elegant suit that Alexander had insisted on buying for him. Mrs. Whitman sat in the front row, her face radiant with joy. The ceremony was small, just the three of them and a minister who asked no questions about their unconventional family. They had found Thomas Clark living exactly where Marcus had said he would be. The confrontation had been painful, but necessary. Matthew's father was a broken man, consumed by guilt and religious obsession, but he was also human, fragile, flawed, and desperately in need of forgiveness. Matthew gave it to him, not because he deserved it, but because carrying the anger was too heavy a burden to bear any longer. As for Marcus, he had disappeared after Alexander's lawyers made it clear that any further harassment would result in legal action. The inheritance remained Alexander's, and by extension, Matthew's. They used part of it to establish a foundation that provided support for young people aging out of the foster care system. Kids who, like Matthew, needed someone to believe in them and give them a chance. Mrs. Whitman moved into the guest house on the property, maintaining her independence while staying close to the family she'd helped create. She never admitted whether the letter from 1997 was real or an elaborate fiction designed to give Matthew a sense of destiny and purpose. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the love they'd built together, the life they'd created from the fragments of their individual stories. On quiet evenings, Matthew would sit in the garden with Alexander, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. He thought sometimes about the young man he'd been, afraid, lonely, convinced that love was something other people experienced but never him. That man felt like a stranger now, someone from a half-remembered dream. He had learned that love wasn't a reward for perfection or a prize for following all the rules. Love was a choice, made every day in small moments and grand gestures alike. It was Alexander bringing him coffee in the morning, exactly the way he liked it. It was Mrs. Whitman's delighted laughter when they told her about their plans to adopt a child. It was the quiet certainty that whatever challenges life brought, they would face them together. The boy who had grown up believing that silence was safety had found his voice. The man who had thought he was broken had discovered that his scars were simply proof that he had survived, that he was stronger than he'd ever imagined. And in the end, that was the greatest revelation of all. Not that love was possible, but that he was worthy of it, exactly as he was. End of story. Dear readers, we hope Matthew and Alexander's journey has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours. Their story reminds us that love can find us in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the very experiences that break us open are the ones that make room for something beautiful to grow. If this tale of forbidden love, family secrets, and redemption moved you, we've prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating stories of love conquering all odds. You can find it by clicking the link to your left. Each story in our collection explores the complexity of human emotion and the transformative power of love. If you enjoyed Matthew and Alexander's story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that dive deep into the human experience, tales of love, loss, redemption, and hope that remind us what it means to be alive. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a love that changed everything? Do you believe in destiny, or do you think we create our own fate? Share your thoughts and your own stories with our community of listeners who, like you, believe in the power of love to transform lives. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Until next time, remember that your story matters, your love matters, and somewhere out there,